You're about to dive into one of the most bizarre, dramatic, and downright suspicious events in medieval history. A story of power, betrayal, secret societies, and a downfall so outrageous that even modern conspiracy theories can't compete. Tonight, we uncover the fall of the Knights Templar, a legendary order of warrior monks who went from being one of the wealthiest and most powerful forces in Europe to being hunted down, imprisoned, tortured, and burned at the stake in a political scheme so absurd that it could have been a Hollywood plot. This isn't fiction. This really happened, and you are about to relive the moment that ended one of history's greatest mysteries. Before we begin, subscribe, because there's more history waiting for you. Also, comment below. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? Well, wherever you are, whatever the hour. Let's go back to the 14th century, when the Templars still held immense power, and the greed of one king would set their fate in motion. The story of the Knights Templar begins in the chaotic aftermath of the First Crusade, a time when the roads to the Holy Land were treacherous, filled with bandits, mercenaries, and hostile forces that saw vulnerable Christian pilgrims as easy prey. It was in this environment, in 1119, that a small group of knights, led by Jacques de Molay, made a decision that would ultimately change the course of history. These knights were not driven by wealth or territorial ambition. They sought a higher purpose, an ideological mission that would set them apart from any military order before them. Their goal was simple but critical: to protect those who traveled to the sacred sites of Christianity. The First Crusade had successfully taken Jerusalem, but securing the city was only part of the battle. Those making the pilgrimage found themselves exposed to constant danger, threatened by opportunistic raiders and rival factions who saw the Christian presence in the Holy Land as a challenge to their own power. There was no organized force ensuring their safety, no central authority keeping the roads clear of violence, and so Jacques de Molay and his knights took up the responsibility themselves, forming what would soon become one of the most formidable military orders in history. Initially, their numbers were small, their resources limited, and their base of operations was humble. They were granted quarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, occupying a section of the royal palace and adopting a name that would reflect their new position. The poor fellow, soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But despite their modest beginnings, they quickly gained recognition, earning favor from noble patrons who saw their mission as essential to the future of Christian rule in the region. Word of their dedication and bravery spread across Europe, attracting attention from key figures within the church, including Pope Honorius Siculus and King Baldwin Tubbayo of Jerusalem, both of whom saw the strategic value in an elite force committed to protecting Christian interests. Unlike standard knights, who owed loyalty to local lords, the Templars existed outside feudal obligations, answering instead directly to the Pope, making them independent of regional politics and free to operate wherever their mission required. Their rise was solidified in 1139, when Pope Innocent X issued a papal bull granting the Templars special privileges that would set them apart from other military orders. They were granted financial independence, exemption from local laws, and the ability to recruit members across Europe without interference. This singular act turned them from a small group of knights into a formidable institution, establishing them as a critical force in the ongoing struggle for control of the Holy Land. But at their core, their mission remained the same. They existed to protect Christian pilgrims, ensuring that those who journeyed to Jerusalem would no longer fall victim to the dangers that lurked on the roads. The meteoric rise of the Knights Templar was fueled not only by their military prowess, but also by the unprecedented privileges granted to them by the Church. In 1139, Pope Innocent X issued a powerful decree, the papal bull Datum Optimum, a document that would transform the Templars from a mere knightly order into one of the most independent and influential forces in medieval Europe. This papal bull shattered all normal expectations of what a knightly order could be, effectively granting the Templars autonomy that no other group enjoyed. Unlike other warriors who served kings and feudal lords, the Templars were now above local law, answering only to the Pope himself, free from taxation, interference, or oversight from secular rulers. This decree gave the Templars an advantage that monarchs and noble families soon grew to envy. It meant that no regional ruler could claim jurisdiction over them, no taxation could drain their finances, and no interference could disrupt their operations. They were untouchable, an organization that could expand its wealth, territories, and influence without restriction, all under the protection of the Church itself. These privileges allowed the Templars to spread like no other military order before them, establishing commanderies across Europe, accumulating lands, and positioning themselves not just as warriors, but as administrators and financiers of the Christian world. And it was precisely because of this unparalleled autonomy that the Templars soon discovered their second great power: finance. Warfare required funding, and the Templars, with their vast network of fortresses, estates, and connections, quickly became the world's first international bankers. Pilgrims, nobles, and even kings turned to them for financial security, entrusting their wealth to an organization whose influence stretched across continents, offering the earliest forms of credit, safekeeping, and financial transactions that would reshape how medieval money moved. The transformation of the Knights Templar from a purely military order into one of the most powerful financial institutions of medieval Europe was not immediate. It was gradual, shaped by necessity, opportunity, and the realization that control over wealth meant control over kingdoms. At first, their financial operations were practical and simple, designed to assist pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land by offering safekeeping for valuables and an early form of credit that allowed travelers to avoid carrying large sums of money across dangerous territories. But as the Templars expanded their reach, their financial system grew into something far more sophisticated. So much so that by the height of their influence, they had become indispensable to kings and nobles alike, offering loans, managing assets, and serving as trusted financial overseers in a world where instability was the norm. Their initial foray into banking came from a practical need. Pilgrims heading to Jerusalem faced constant danger from bandits and hostile forces, making it risky to carry gold or valuable possessions. The Templars devised a solution. Pilgrims could deposit money or assets at a local Templar outpost in Europe, and upon arrival in the Holy Land, they could withdraw the equivalent amount from the Templar commanderies there. This system, though rudimentary by modern standards, was revolutionary at the time, allowing individuals to travel without fear of losing their wealth to thieves. Over time, this simple exchange mechanism evolved into a broader financial network, with the Templars handling wealth transfers, currency exchanges, and even property transactions for European nobles. As their financial operations expanded, they became known not just as warriors, but as trusted financiers, offering loans to kings in times of war, managing estates for the nobility, and even serving as advisors for major economic decisions. Monarchs who found themselves short on funds frequently turned to the Templars, knowing that their vast wealth and organizational discipline made them the most reliable financial institution in Europe. The sheer scale of their monetary influence gave them leverage that few could challenge. They were able to dictate the terms of loans, influence diplomatic negotiations, and exercise significant control over trade routes. What made their financial system particularly effective was its secrecy and security. Unlike conventional medieval treasuries, which were vulnerable to corruption and sudden raids, the Templars operated across multiple regions, ensuring that their financial assets were protected through a decentralized network. They had commanderies spread across Europe, each serving as a financial hub where wealth was stored, recorded, and transferred with precision. Their reputation for integrity and efficiency meant that many noble families entrusted their fortunes to the Templars, allowing them to handle estates, administer taxes, and even provide financial strategies for sustaining wealth. But this level of financial dominance also made them dangerous in the eyes of European rulers, particularly those who relied too heavily on Templar loans. Kings who once saw them as valuable allies began to resent their independence, realizing that an organization with more financial power than the monarchy itself posed a serious threat to absolute rule. It was not just Philip IV of France who grew wary. Many leaders across Europe felt uneasy about the degree to which the Templars controlled economic stability, fearing that their influence could one day be used against them. Their financial empire extended beyond just money. They held land, castles, and agricultural estates, further increasing their wealth and political influence. Unlike typical banks, their holdings were physical, meaning that they could not only control wealth, but also exert territorial dominance over key regions. The influence of the Knights Templar stretched far beyond their financial empire. They owned vast amounts of land, castles, and agricultural estates, making them not only the guardians of Christian wealth, but also one of the largest landowning institutions in medieval Europe. As their power expanded, they acquired territories across France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the Holy Land, creating a network of fortified strongholds that served both as military bases and administrative centers. Unlike typical feudal lords who governed land for personal wealth, the Templars treated their estates as assets to fund their mission, ensuring continuous support for their forces in the Crusader states, while reinforcing their influence in the European courts. The land they owned was not just for defense. It was highly productive, consisting of farmlands, vineyards, livestock pastures, and even industrial hubs where goods were produced and traded. They cultivated wheat, barley, and olives, oversaw wine production, and managed herds of cattle and sheep, creating a self-sustaining economy that ensured financial stability without relying on external sources. These estates became some of the most valuable agricultural holdings in medieval Europe, allowing the order to generate enormous revenue without needing to depend entirely on banking or donations. Even kings and noble families sought deals with the Templars, leasing their land or purchasing goods produced within their territories, further strengthening their presence in the economic affairs of Christendom. In addition to their agricultural wealth, their castles stood as imposing symbols of military strength, some of which were designed with cutting-edge fortification techniques that rivaled even royal strongholds. These castles were strategically placed along important trade routes, ensuring not only security, but also control over commerce and movement across regions. Many of their fortresses in Europe were built to withstand sieges, featuring thick stone walls, deep moats, reinforced towers, and hidden escape routes, all of which made them incredibly difficult to capture, even by organized armies. Some, like Tomar in Portugal and Temple Church in London, became central hubs for their operations, housing archives, treasuries, and war supplies essential to their broader mission. But their most fortified holdings were in the Holy Land, where they maintained a critical military presence as the Crusader states faced growing threats from Muslim forces. Unlike their European estates, which functioned as economic centers, their fortresses in the Middle East were built solely for war. They controlled key locations such as Crac des Chevaliers, Château Pied-Lérin, and the fortified city of Acre, each designed to withstand prolonged conflicts and coordinate defense strategies against Islamic armies. Here, the Templars were not just landowners. They were warriors, stationed in the heart of battle, leading the charge in some of the most significant clashes between the Christian and Muslim forces during the Crusades. The military presence of Knights Templar in the Holy Land was not merely symbolic. It was an essential force in the defense and expansion of Crusader states, ensuring that Christian holdings remained protected against the relentless counterattacks of Islamic armies. From their earliest days, the Templars had been stationed across the most strategically significant regions of the Levant, embedding themselves within the very heart of conflict, where the boundaries between survival and annihilation were constantly tested. Unlike many knights of Europe, who fought sporadically or served kings for temporary campaigns, the Templars were a permanent military presence, dedicated not to any particular nation, but to the broader cause of Christendom. Their loyalty to the Church made them one of the most reliable and disciplined fighting forces of the Crusades, and their combat experience far exceeded that of ordinary feudal warriors, who often lacked coordination and training at the level of the Templars. Their strongholds in the Holy Land were built with precision, engineered to endure prolonged sieges, and positioned at vital locations to control trade routes, military supply chains, and the movement of Christian forces. Some of their most famous fortifications included Crac des Chevaliers, Château Pied-Lérin, and their headquarters in Jerusalem's Temple Mount, each designed to withstand immense pressure from enemy assaults. Within these fortresses, the Templars trained relentlessly, honing their skills in warfare, strategy, and siege defense, making them one of the most formidable defenders of Crusader territory. Their presence alone struck fear into opposing armies, as they were known not just for their combat effectiveness, but for their near fanatical dedication to victory, often choosing death over surrender, ensuring that Christian land was never abandoned without a fight. The battles they fought were some of the most intense of the Crusades. During the Siege of Acre in 1291, the Templars stood as the last line of defense against the advancing Mamluk forces, refusing to retreat even as the city crumbled around them. They held their fortress within Acre until the very last moment, ensuring that their resistance allowed civilians and remaining soldiers to escape before ultimately being cut down in one of the most brutal final stands in medieval warfare. Even in defeat, their reputation only grew, as chroniclers recorded their unwavering loyalty to the cause, their refusal to flee, and their willingness to fight to the last man, traits that cemented their status as legends among Christian warriors. Their ability to maintain a stronghold in the Holy Land for so long was a testament to their wealth, discipline, and strategic expertise. Unlike conventional armies that required financial backing from kings, the Templars were self-sufficient, using their financial empire to fund their military campaigns, supply their troops, and construct defensive fortifications that rivaled even royal castles. Their extensive financial system, their control over land, and their backing from the papacy made them one of the most powerful forces within Christendom. elevating them from mere knights to an organization so wealthy and influential that even monarchs depended on their support. The Knights Templar, once a small band of warriors dedicated solely to protecting pilgrims, had by the 13th century transformed into one of the wealthiest and most influential organizations in Christendom. Their financial empire, fueled by banking, land ownership, and strategic military operations, allowed them to extend their reach across Europe and the Middle East, securing their position as indispensable players in both war and politics. No longer just knights, they had become landowners, financiers, diplomats, and commanders, their influence stretching far beyond the battlefield. Their wealth was unmatched, rivaling even that of monarchs. Their financial services, once intended to safeguard the money of travelers, had evolved into a complex system of banking and credit, with noble families and rulers relying on them not only for safekeeping, but for loans and financial management. Unlike feudal lords, whose wealth was tied to taxation and personal estates, the Templars had a vast, decentralized network that ensured their financial strength was nearly impervious to collapse. Their commanderies, established in nearly every major European kingdom, functioned as both military outposts and financial centers, allowing them to control money flow, trade routes, and logistical supply chains. And this influence was not just economic, it was political. Popes and kings alike turned to the Templars for support, seeing them as essential allies in times of war and uncertainty. Their autonomy, granted by papal decree, meant that they operated independently of local rulers, answering only to the Vatican, a status that gave them immense leverage in European affairs. Kings borrowed money from them, sought their military aid, and even relied on their mediation in territorial disputes. In many ways, they were more powerful than many royal families, a fact that would later contribute to their downfall when rulers saw their independence as a threat rather than an advantage. But their military strength was still central to their identity. Their fortresses, strategically placed across the Holy Land, ensured they remained a dominant force in Crusader warfare. Unlike traditional armies, which suffered from lack of coordination, unreliable funding, and shifting loyalties, the Templars were disciplined, well-equipped, and committed to their mission regardless of political changes. Their reputation as fearless warriors willing to fight to the death made them the backbone of Christian defenses in the Middle East, serving as front-line forces in every major crusade. However, as history would soon show, no power remains unchallenged forever. By the mid-13th century, the tides of war began to turn against the Crusader states as Muslim forces grew stronger, more organized, and increasingly determined to reclaim Jerusalem and other Christian-held territories. In 1244, the fall of Jerusalem to Muslim armies marked a devastating blow to Crusader morale, forcing the Templars to rethink their position in the region and begin the difficult task of maintaining their dwindling strongholds against ever-mounting opposition. The fall of Jerusalem in 2044 marked a turning point in the history of the Crusades, and, more critically, the role of the Knights Templar. For more than a century, Christian forces had held the city, seeing it as the heart of their mission in the Holy Land. It was more than just a military stronghold. It was a symbol, a beacon of the Crusader effort to establish permanent Christian control over territory that had long been contested. But despite the fortifications, the garrisons, and the relentless efforts to hold the city, Jerusalem fell to Muslim forces. A devastating blow, not just for the Christian kingdoms, but for the Templars themselves. Their primary mission, defending the Holy Land, was now in jeopardy and with it, their influence as a dominant military order. The battle for Jerusalem had been brutal. The Khwarezmian forces, fierce warriors driven by their own displacement, stormed the city with overwhelming force, cutting through Crusader defenses and delivering a crushing defeat to Christian troops. This wasn't simply another territorial loss. It was a psychological catastrophe, shaking the very foundations of Crusader confidence and forcing military leaders to rethink their position in the region. The Templars, who had built their reputation as unwavering protectors of Christian lands, suddenly found themselves without the one city they had sworn to defend at all costs. With Jerusalem gone, the remaining Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land faced increased pressure and isolation. The Muslim forces, emboldened by their victory, launched continuous campaigns to drive the Crusaders further west, picking apart their defenses one stronghold at a time. The Templars, now forced into a defensive position, had to rely on their remaining fortresses, including Acre, Tripoli, and Jaffa, to maintain any sort of control. But the reality was clear. The tides had turned, and the days of Christian dominance in the region were numbered. The loss of Jerusalem had another devastating effect. It fractured the Crusader leadership. Political infighting among Christian rulers, combined with dwindling support from Europe, made it increasingly difficult to mount effective counteroffensives. The once unified push to reclaim the Holy Land crumbled under disagreements, conflicting strategies, and a general sense of defeatism. The Templars, despite their strength and experience, could not fight alone, and without widespread military backing, their ability to hold territory grew weaker with each passing year. As the years progressed, the Crusader states continued to shrink, their influence slowly eroded by unrelenting attacks. By 1271, the Christian forces had lost nearly all meaningful footholds, leaving only a handful of fortified cities standing against overwhelming opposition. The Templars, once the backbone of Crusader warfare, were now fighting for survival, clinging to their last stronghold, Acre, the final major Crusader city, where their fate would soon be decided. By the late 13th century, the Crusader states were collapsing at an alarming rate. Their once expansive Christian territories reduced to isolated fortresses clinging to survival against relentless enemy forces. Every major battle had drained resources, morale, and manpower, leaving only a handful of strongholds standing between the Crusaders and total defeat. Among these, Acre remained the last significant Crusader city, an economic and military hub that had withstood multiple sieges over the years. But by 1291, even Acre was no longer safe. The Mamluks, the rising dominant force of the Middle East, launched their final offensive, determined to drive the Crusaders out for good. The siege of Acre was a brutal, relentless campaign, and despite the Templars' expertise in siege warfare, the numbers were not in their favor. The Mamluks surrounded the city with an overwhelming force, deploying battering rams, siege towers, and waves of infantry determined to bring down the city's defenses. The Templars, alongside other remaining Crusader factions, fought viciously, trying to repel the invasion and hold on to their last stronghold, but the reality was unavoidable. Acre was doomed. As the walls were breached, the city erupted into chaos, its streets flooded with battle, flames, and devastation. The Templars made their final stand in their fortress, desperately attempting to protect the escape of civilians and remaining Christian forces. But the overwhelming tide could not be held back. With Acre's fall, the Christian presence in the Holy Land was effectively wiped out, marking the end of an era of Crusader rule and delivering a catastrophic blow to the military role of the Knights Templar. The Order, once regarded as the most formidable defenders of Christendom, now found itself without a battlefield, without a clear military purpose, and without the justification that had once fueled its power. As the Crusades dwindled into failure, questions arose. What would become of the Templars now? They had built their reputation on warfare, but with no more Crusader states to defend, their existence was beginning to be questioned. With the fall of Acre in 1291, the Knights Templar had lost their last major foothold in the Holy Land, effectively bringing their original mission to an end. For nearly 2 centuries, they had been the backbone of Christian military efforts in the region, fighting in countless battles, maintaining fortresses, and defending Crusader territories from Muslim forces. But now, with no Crusader states left to protect, the very foundation of their existence was beginning to crumble. Their status as warriors had been central to their identity, yet without a battlefield, they faced an existential crisis. One that would put them in direct conflict with European rulers. The problem was not just their lack of military function. It was their immense wealth, influence, and independence. The Templars owned vast stretches of land, controlled financial networks, and operated outside the reach of secular authorities, answering only to the Pope. While this autonomy had once been an advantage, granting them freedom to fight without political interference, it now made them a target. Without the Crusades to justify their presence, rulers across Europe began to question why the Templars still held such vast resources, especially when many kings were struggling financially. The loss of military purpose led to speculation, suspicion, and envy. Why did the Templars need so much wealth if they were no longer fighting? Why were they exempt from taxation when kingdoms were desperate for funds? As their financial operations expanded, their role shifted. They were no longer viewed as warriors, but as bankers, administrators, and landowners, holding assets that monarchs increasingly saw as an obstacle to their own power. The Templars had, in many ways, become too successful for their own good, positioning themselves as Europe's most influential financial institution, capable of loaning money to monarchs and managing their estates. And one king in particular saw this wealth as a direct threat to his rule: Philip IV of France, a ruler drowning in debt from wars with England and disputes with the papacy. Having borrowed extensively from the Templars, Philip found himself financially dependent on an organization he could not control, a position that no king would accept for long. Desperate to recover his losses and consolidate his power, Philip began plotting the downfall of the very institution that had once funded his wars. By the early 1300s, King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, found himself in a precarious financial position, largely due to his prolonged wars with England and his ongoing conflicts with the papacy. Warfare was a costly endeavor, requiring immense resources to fund troops, maintain fortifications, and sustain logistical supply chains. Unlike rulers, who could rely on stable tax systems, Philip had exhausted traditional sources of revenue, forcing him to seek loans from institutions wealthy enough to support his military ambitions. Among these, the Knights Templar stood out as one of the only organizations capable of financing monarchs at such a scale, and Philip became increasingly dependent on them to fund his campaigns. At first, the relationship between Philip and the Templars was purely transactional. They provided him with financial backing, and in return, he granted them political favor and privileges within the French kingdom. But over time, Philip's debt grew, and his desperation to maintain control over his kingdom deepened. Unlike feudal lords, who had access to wealth through land ownership. The Templars operated outside the traditional feudal system, meaning their financial empire was independent of royal authority. This made them dangerous in Philip's eyes, as their influence extended beyond France, giving them leverage that even the monarchy could not challenge directly. Philip saw the Templars not just as a financial institution, but as an obstacle to absolute power. They controlled vast territories, banking networks, and military strongholds, all without being subject to his rule. Their special privileges, granted by the Pope, ensured that they operated beyond the grasp of secular rulers, making them one of the few entities in France that Philip could not tax, regulate, or manipulate. This growing frustration led Philip to seek ways to undermine their independence, looking for any possible excuse to dismantle their control over France's financial system. But Philip's ambitions went beyond mere financial control. He wanted to consolidate all power under his rule, including authority over religious institutions. The influence of the papacy had long dictated the structure of Christian Europe, and Philip, eager to reinforce his sovereignty, saw an opportunity to assert dominance over the church itself. Philip IV of France had always been driven by an obsession with absolute control, and in his pursuit of unchecked authority, the church itself became one of his primary targets. For centuries, the papacy had maintained its position as the ultimate power in Christian Europe, dictating religious doctrine, influencing political affairs, and often challenging the authority of monarchs. While most rulers accepted this arrangement, navigating the delicate balance between crown and church, Philip refused to bow to Rome, determined to assert his dominance over both secular and religious institutions alike. His struggles with the papacy had begun long before his conflict with the Templars. In his bid to expand French influence, he clashed with Pope Boniface V, who resisted his efforts to tax the clergy and interfere in church affairs. Philip saw these restrictions as an unacceptable limitation on his sovereignty, and rather than negotiate, he launched a direct assault on papal authority, ultimately orchestrating Boniface's humiliation and eventual demise. When Boniface was succeeded by Pope Clement V, Philip ensured that the new pope operated under French influence, further solidifying his control over the church. With Clement now dependent on Philip's favor, the king saw an opportunity to reshape religious power to suit his ambitions. The Knights Templar, once invaluable allies in the Crusades, had become problematic in his eyes, too rich, too influential, and worst of all, outside his control. Their independence, granted by papal decree, meant that they answered only to Rome, not to any king, allowing them to exist as an autonomous force, with financial, military, and political leverage that Philip simply could not manipulate. And in a kingdom where Philip tolerated no rival power, the Templars were now seen not as allies, but as threats, standing in direct opposition to his vision of absolute monarchy. Philip IV of France had never been a ruler who tolerated rivals, especially not those who held more power and wealth than he did. And by the early 1300s, the Knights Templar had become just that, an organization, with far-reaching influence, vast financial resources, and a status that placed them above secular authority. They owned land, castles, and estates across Europe, operated as international bankers, and answered only to the Pope, which meant that Philip had no control over them whatsoever. For a king obsessed with absolute rule, this was unacceptable. At first, Philip had merely resented their independence, their ability to loan money to kings, manage their own affairs without royal oversight, and maintain a military structure. completely separate from the French crown. But resentment soon turned to fear as Philip realized that the Templars were not just wealthy, but politically influential, capable of shaping economic decisions and influencing Europe's power balance without his approval. They had become an obstacle, and in Philip's eyes, obstacles had to be removed. Of course, he couldn't simply strip them of their privileges outright. The Pope had granted them special status, and any attempt to weaken their authority would have required a battle with the Vatican itself. But Philip had no patience for slow political maneuvering. Instead, he began laying the groundwork for their destruction, carefully turning public opinion against them, spreading suspicion, and setting the stage for one of the most infamous betrayals in medieval history. The first step in Philip's plan was propaganda. He began circulating rumors that the Templars were not the noble warriors they claimed to be, but secretive, corrupt figures engaged in dark practices behind the walls of their commanderies. He needed to paint them as villains, as an order so dangerous that its continued existence threatened the very stability of France. And so, accusations emerged, whispers of heresy, blasphemy, greed, and secret rituals that defied Christian teachings. Were they truly loyal to the Church, or had they abandoned their faith in pursuit of wealth and power? Were they conducting mysterious ceremonies in secret? Were they conspiring against the monarchy itself? The rumors spread, and before long, the seeds of doubt had taken root in the minds of the nobility. Philip, of course, had no actual proof. The Templars had existed for nearly 2 centuries without any major scandal, and their financial success was a result of careful management, not deception. But medieval politics were rarely built on evidence. They thrived on accusations, fear, and manipulative schemes, and Philip knew exactly how to use these to his advantage. Once suspicion had been planted, all he needed was an excuse to act. And so, on Friday, October 13, 1307, Philip made his move. In one swift and brutal operation, he ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in France, launching a kingdom-wide purge that sent shockwaves through Europe. Philip Ivar of France had spent years carefully building the case against the Knights Templar, painting them as a rogue organization that had grown too powerful, too wealthy, and too independent. He understood that outright attacking such a well-respected order would not be easily justified, especially given their standing with the Pope and their reputation as defenders of Christendom. But Philip was a master of manipulation, and by October 1307, he had successfully sown enough doubt and suspicion that public opinion was beginning to turn against the Templars. The rumors of secretive rituals, corruption, and unspeakable crimes had spread far enough that no one was entirely sure what to believe anymore, and that uncertainty was exactly what Philip needed to act. The operation he launched on Friday, October 13, 1307, was meticulously planned, designed to catch the Templars completely off guard and prevent them from organizing any resistance. Orders were sent across France, instructing royal officials to simultaneously arrest every Templar within the kingdom, a move that shocked even those who had doubted the order's innocence. These knights, once celebrated as warriors of God, were suddenly dragged from their commanderies, seized in their homes, and thrown into chains, and most of them had no idea why. The arrests were swift and brutal, with no formal warnings, no trials, and no opportunity for defense. It was a purge unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen, and it was carried out with ruthless precision. Philip understood that timing was everything. A coordinated, nationwide attack meant the Templars could not mount any unified resistance, and with their leaders imprisoned their ability to respond politically was completely crippled. The Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was among those arrested, and his capture was essential to Philip's plan. By securing the highest-ranking members first, Philip ensured that any attempts to dispute the accusations would be fragmented and disorganized, leaving the Order defenseless in the face of mounting allegations. But Philip knew that simply arresting the Templars would not be enough. He needed to convince the world that they were guilty, that their destruction was not just political maneuvering, but a necessary purge of corruption within Christendom. And so, the accusations began to pour in, each more outrageous than the last. The Templars were charged with heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, sodomy, and financial corruption, their supposed crimes spanning every possible sin that could turn public opinion against them. Of course, none of these accusations had any real evidence behind them. But Philip was not interested in proof. He was interested in securing confessions, and he had no intention of allowing the Knights to deny the charges. Philip IV of France knew that arresting the Knights Templar alone would not be enough. He needed to convince the world that their destruction was justified, that they had not simply become inconvenient for him, but that they had truly betrayed Christianity itself. And so, the accusations began to flood in, each one carefully constructed to maximize outrage, fear, and disgust, turning the once revered knights into villains in the eyes of Europe. The charges ranged from religious crimes to outright depravity, ensuring that no matter where a person's moral convictions lay, there was something in the accusations that could justify hatred toward the Templars. They were accused of heresy, a charge that was enough on its own to warrant their destruction in the medieval Christian world. According to Philip's prosecutors, the Templars had abandoned their faith, engaging in secret rites that mocked the very religion they had sworn to protect. They were said to spit on the cross during initiation ceremonies, renounce Christ, and worship strange idols, figures described in contradictory terms, sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a human head, sometimes as a demonic entity shrouded in mystery. Had they truly fallen into paganism? Or was this simply propaganda designed to turn public opinion against them? It didn't matter. Once such rumors were unleashed, there was no undoing the damage. Blasphemy was another cornerstone of the accusations. They were said to mock Christian prayers, to utter profanities in their secret meetings, and to engage in rituals that desecrated holy symbols. These claims played into the deep anxieties of medieval society, where faith was not just a personal belief, but the foundation upon which entire kingdoms were built. To suggest that the Templars, once regarded as the sword and shield of Christianity, had now turned against their own religion, was more than just a legal charge. It was a betrayal of everything they once stood for. Idolatry was another damning accusation, one tied closely to the claims of strange objects used in their ceremonies. Reports spread that they worshipped a mysterious head, possibly the severed remains of John the Baptist, or perhaps some sinister artifact connected to lost ancient cults. Some whispers went further, suggesting that this idol granted them supernatural powers, that their military prowess was not simply a result of training, but of dark, forbidden forces. Were these mere fabrications, designed to twist their disciplined secrecy into something terrifying? Or had Philip found the perfect way to make their religious standing seem irredeemable? And then there were the charges of sodomy, allegations of depravity that carried an immense social and moral weight in medieval Christian society. To accuse an entire order of knights of engaging in unnatural acts of violating the moral laws of their faith, of corrupting their own brothers in arms, was to taint them beyond redemption, ensuring no ruler, no priest, no noble would dare come to their defense. These accusations were vague, intentionally so, designed to suggest that their secret gatherings hid dark sins, scandalous behaviors, and unholy rituals. But more than anything, they served a simple purpose: shock, the kind needed to turn whispers into certainty, suspicion into condemnation. Financial corruption, theft, and hoarding were the last major charges, and in some ways, these were the most believable to Philip's audience. The Templars had amassed unmatched wealth, held vast estates, and operated as bankers to kings and noble families alike. Could it really be that they had grown too greedy, prioritizing money over their religious duty? Had their loans, their holdings, their secretive records been proof of sinful dealings, rather than sound financial strategy? It was easy for people to believe that those with immense wealth were dishonest, and Philip capitalized on this sentiment masterfully. But none of these accusations had any concrete evidence. The Templars had been operating under papal approval for nearly 2 centuries, and never in that time had they been caught engaging in anything remotely like the crimes Philip accused them of. But medieval justice did not operate on proof. It thrived on fear, coercion, and forced confessions. And Philip had every intention of using these tools to his advantage. The arrests were carried out with meticulous planning, executed so efficiently that the Templars had no time to react, no way to organize a defense, no opportunity to flee. In one night, hundreds of knights were seized across France, their properties confiscated, their assets frozen, their leadership thrown into dungeons. It was one of the most infamous events in medieval history, a mass betrayal so shocking that it would later be remembered as the origin of the unlucky Friday the 13th legend, forever associating the date with sudden misfortune, treachery, and unexpected downfall. Philip IV's meticulously executed purge of the Knights Templar on Friday, October 13, 1307, remains one of the most infamous events in medieval history, not only for its brutality and deception, but also for the unprecedented coordination and secrecy involved in carrying it out. Every detail of the arrests had been planned down to the last moment, ensuring that the Templars were given no opportunity to resist, no chance to flee, and no time to plead their innocence before the world could react. It was a masterstroke in political maneuvering, allowing Philip to strike with absolute precision, delivering a single, crushing blow to an organization that had existed for nearly 2 centuries without ever facing such a devastating attack from within Christendom itself. The significance of Friday the 13th in the context of the Templar Purge is often debated, but there is no doubt that this particular date became forever associated with misfortune, treachery, and sudden downfall. The arrest of the Templars was not merely an act of royal enforcement. It was an ambush, a betrayal executed under the guise of justice, and the sheer scale of the operation ensured that its shockwaves rippled across Europe. The simultaneous arrests, carried out in the dead of night, sent hundreds of knights into dungeons, leaving their fortresses abandoned, their wealth frozen, and their leadership completely shattered. Even those who had doubted Philip's motivations found themselves stunned by the ruthlessness of his actions. As an entire order was uprooted within hours, their fate sealed before they even understood what was happening. The strategy Philip employed relied heavily on secrecy. In the weeks leading up to October 13, 1307, orders were quietly issued, instructing royal officials across France to prepare for mass arrests, but only at the designated moment. This prevented any leaks of information, ensuring that no Templar could anticipate the betrayal or take action to protect themselves, their assets, or their archives. When the arrests were finally set into motion, the Knights had no idea what they were being accused of, no warning that their downfall had already been decided. There was no trial, no negotiation, no opportunity for defense. Only shackles, chains and darkness. The efficiency of the operation was staggering. Royal enforcers, backed by Philip's military forces, moved in with ruthless precision, tearing through Templar strongholds, dragging knights from their beds, and confiscating every document, artifact, and financial record they could find. Their commanders were separated from their soldiers, ensuring that no one could organize a counter-response. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was seized before he had time to send out warnings, effectively decapitating the leadership structure before any coordinated resistance could take place. Even beyond France, the fallout of Philip's purge spread rapidly. Other European rulers, watching the events unfold, began to question their own relationships with the Templars, unsure whether they should intervene or follow Philip's lead. While some monarchs hesitated, reluctant to dismantle such an influential order without more solid proof, the damage had already been done. The arrests alone were enough to turn suspicion into certainty, reinforcing the fabricated narrative that the Templars had truly fallen into corruption, had truly become enemies of Christendom. Whether Philip's accusations were real no longer mattered. The world was watching, and most were willing to believe what they had been told. But Philip knew that arrests alone would not be enough. The Templars were respected warriors, figures who had served Christianity for centuries, and their reputation still carried weight, even in the face of mounting allegations. If he wanted to ensure their complete destruction, he needed confessions. Forced, undeniable confessions, extracted through methods that left no room for denial, no space for dignity, no chance for truth. And so began the darkest chapter in the downfall of the Knights Templar, a period in which prison dungeons became places of horror, where knights who had once stood tall on the battlefield were broken, tortured, and made to admit to crimes they had never committed. Once the Knights Templar had been dragged from their homes, chained, and thrown into dungeons, Philip IV understood that merely accusing them of heresy would not be enough. He needed confessions, declarations that would justify their destruction, and eliminate any lingering doubts about their supposed guilt. And in medieval France, confessions were not obtained through honest questioning or legal proceedings. They were extracted through agony, through methods designed not to uncover the truth, but to break the spirit and force submission. Templars, once proud warriors, were now reduced to prisoners, subjected to horrors beyond imagination. Many were elderly, having spent decades in service to Christianity, their bodies already weakened by the hardships of war. Others were young knights, newly initiated, unaware that their vows of loyalty would lead them to the cold depths of royal dungeons. But no matter their age or rank, none were spared from the brutality that awaited them. The torture chambers were silent but merciless, their methods perfected over years of medieval interrogation practices. The accused were stripped, beaten, starved, and deprived of light for weeks at a time, their bodies growing weaker as their minds unraveled. Some were forced into excruciating positions, limbs twisted and stretched, bones dislocated as pressure was applied. Others were subjected to water torture, their lungs filled again and again, choking them until they could no longer resist the demand for a confession. The most infamous method was the rack, a device designed to tear muscle from bone, elongating the body to inhuman proportions. Many Templars, once hardened warriors, could withstand some degree of pain, but the rack had no limits, no escape. When tightened, it left the victim disfigured, crippled, and incapable of further resistance. Knights who had faced battle with unwavering courage now found themselves begging for death, their physical endurance no match for the merciless devices used against them. And as expected, confessions began to pour in, each one coerced through suffering, each admission not the truth, but an attempt to end the torment. Knights who had once defended Christendom were now declaring themselves heretics, accused of crimes they had never committed, simply because it was the only way to escape their agony. The allegations forced upon them were specific, bizarre, and designed to maximize scandal. Spitting on the cross during initiation, renouncing Christ, engaging in secret rituals of idolatry, all confessions secured through pain, all meant to turn their legacy into one of betrayal, rather than honor. And among the most infamous accusations was their supposed worship of Baphomet, a mysterious idol described in conflicting terms, sometimes as a human head, sometimes as a cat, sometimes as a demonic figure whose true nature was shrouded in secrecy. Once the Knights Templar were dragged into Philip IV's dungeons. Their fate was sealed not by truth, but by torture. Their interrogators, operating under direct orders from the Crown, had no interest in uncovering reality. They needed confessions, regardless of whether the alleged crimes had ever occurred. And as the pain intensified, the accusations followed, each one more calculated than the last, designed to inflame outrage, incite fear, and turn the once revered order into an abomination in the eyes of Christendom. Among the most bizarre and damning allegations was the charge that Templar initiates spat upon the cross during their induction ceremonies. This accusation, if proven true, would mean not only heresy, but complete rejection of Christianity itself. The image of warrior monks, sworn to defend Christendom, actively mocking the very faith they were meant to protect, was as scandalous as it was unbelievable. But in medieval France, the mere suggestion of such a betrayal was enough to brand them as enemies of God. And Philip ensured that this claim was repeated again and again, until it embedded itself into the consciousness of Europe. Then came the supposed worship of Baphomet, an enigmatic idol that would later fuel centuries of speculation and conspiracy theories. According to Philip's prosecutors, the Templars had replaced their devotion to Christ with allegiance to this mysterious entity, conducting secret rites in its name, bowing before it, and drawing their strength from its supernatural power. Descriptions of the idol varied wildly. Some claimed it was a severed head, possibly that of John the Baptist, while others insisted it was a demonic figure with horns and wings, evidence that the Templars had fallen into occultism and satanic worship. There were even reports that some members kissed the idol as part of their ceremonies, further reinforcing the notion that they had abandoned true faith in favor of sorcery and paganism. Charges of homosexual rituals were added to the mix, accusations that further discredited the order in the eyes of Christian rulers. If true, this would mean that the Templars had corrupted their own ranks, engaging in sinful acts within their secluded fortresses, violating not only their religious vows, but also the moral standards of Christian Europe. These claims were particularly damaging, as they tied into deep societal fears of moral decay, ensuring that even the most skeptical observers would hesitate to defend the Knights. The final and most damning accusation was the outright denial of Christ, a charge that left no room for redemption. If the Templars had truly renounced Christ, rejected the Gospels, and turned their backs on the Church, then there was no salvation for them. They would not merely face punishment, but eternal damnation, their legacy burned away by the flames of absolute condemnation. Yet, despite the severity of these accusations, there was little, if any, real evidence to support them. No documents, no testimonies from neutral parties. Nothing that could prove beyond doubt that the Templars had truly fallen into heresy. But Philip did not need proof. He only needed forced confessions, and with torture as his primary tool. He ensured that his version of history was the one that would be recorded. These charges, whether believed or not, ultimately served one critical purpose. They provided Philip with the justification he needed to seize the Templars' assets, ensuring that their vast wealth did not disappear into obscurity, but instead found its way directly into the coffers of the French crown. The accusations leveled against the Knights Templar were not merely an attack on their reputation. They were a calculated maneuver designed to strip them of everything they owned. Philip of France, drowning in debt and desperate to consolidate his power, understood that the wealth of the Templars was the key to solving his financial crisis. The charges of heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, and corruption, while sensational and scandalous, were never truly about faith or morality. They were a smokescreen, a justification to seize the vast fortunes, properties, and financial networks controlled by the Order, ensuring that their downfall served Philip's interests directly. From the moment the arrests were carried out, Philip wasted no time in confiscating Templar assets. Their lands, once spanning across France and beyond, were claimed by the crown, their treasuries emptied into royal coffers, and their financial operations shut down or repurposed to serve Philip's government. With no legal trial concluded, Philip had already begun dismantling the Order in every practical sense, ensuring that even if the Templars were proven innocent, they would never regain their former strength. Yet, despite Philip's dominance over France, the Templars were not just a French institution. They existed across Europe, and their fate could not be decided solely by one king. The Pope held ultimate authority over the Order, and Philip, knowing that he could not act without papal approval, turned his attention toward Rome, pressuring Pope Clement V to launch an official investigation into the Knights Templar, one that would ultimately decide their fate, not just in France, but across the entire Christian world. Despite Philip IV's aggressive campaign against the Knights Templar, he knew that his word alone was not enough to condemn them across Christendom. The Order had been sanctioned by the Church itself, operating under the direct authority of the Pope, and Philip, despite his power, could not simply erase them without papal approval. The legitimacy of his accusations rested on whether Rome would validate his claims, and so Philip turned his sights on Pope Clement V, ensuring that his influence over the Vatican forced an official inquiry into the Order. Clement V, although technically the highest spiritual authority in Europe, was not a strong-willed leader. He was a pope under pressure, caught between the demands of Philip and the rising unease among other monarchs who feared the implications of the attack on the Templars. While some kings hesitated to turn against the Order, Clement found himself unable to resist the might of the French crown, recognizing that defying Philip would risk political upheaval, financial instability, and possibly even war. And so, in 1308, Clement launched a papal investigation, opening an inquiry that would determine whether the charges against the Templars held any truth. But from the beginning, the trial was flawed. manipulated by Philip's agents, who ensured that only the most damning testimonies were presented. The Pope, though aware of the political motivations behind Philip's campaign, did little to protect the integrity of the inquiry, allowing confessions obtained through torture to be accepted as evidence. Templar knights, beaten, starved, and maimed, provided testimonies that were more a product of pain than of truth, their words twisted, exaggerated, and forced to fit Philip's narrative of heresy, corruption, and betrayal. Despite the overwhelming pressure, there were voices within the church that attempted to defend the Templars' officials who questioned the legitimacy of the accusations, urging for a fair trial rather than a predetermined judgment. Some bishops, cardinals, and legal scholars argued that torture invalidated confessions, that the order's long history of loyalty to Christendom should not be erased by politically motivated charges. But those who spoke in favor of the Templars found themselves silenced, their objections dismissed, suppressed, or ignored, as Philip tightened his grip over the proceedings. Despite the overwhelming pressure from Philip IV, not everyone within the church was convinced of the Templars' guilt. Some bishops, cardinals, and legal scholars questioned the legitimacy of the accusations, arguing that an order with 2 centuries of loyal service to Christendom could not possibly have fallen into heresy overnight. The forced confessions, the inconsistencies in the charges, and the clear political motivations behind the trials led many to believe that the accusations were a fabrication, an excuse for Philip to dismantle the order and claim its wealth for himself. But defending the Templars was dangerous. Philip's grip over the proceedings was absolute, and those who attempted to speak in favor of the Knights found themselves pressured into silence. Some clergy members were intimidated, fearing that challenging Philip's version of events would endanger their own positions. Others were removed from key discussions, their protests ignored or dismissed before they could gain traction. Even Pope Clement V, despite his authority as the leader of Christendom, was unable to fully resist Philip's demands. Philip continued his relentless push for total condemnation, ensuring that every piece of evidence presented to the papal inquiry reinforced his narrative. He provided documentation that portrayed the Templars as a threat to Christian stability, emphasizing confessions extracted through torture, ignoring any testimonies that pointed to their innocence. The pressure was immense, and the Pope, already weakened by his compromises with Philip, found himself increasingly cornered. By 1312, Philip had successfully forced Clement V into making a final decision, setting the stage for the Council of Vienne, where the fate of the Knights Templar would be sealed. Despite the lack of definitive proof of heresy, despite the fact that the confessions had been obtained through brutal means, Clement issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, formally dissolving the order, marking the final, official end of the Knights Templar. By the time the Council of Vienne convened in 1312, the fate of the Knights Templar had already been decided in practice, even if formal proceedings were still needed to provide the appearance of legitimacy. Pope Clement V, pressured relentlessly by Philip IV of France, found himself cornered. He could not outright declare the Templars innocent, without risking the wrath of the French king, but he also lacked any definitive proof of heresy. The accusations, while sensational, were built on forced confessions and fabricated rumors, and even after years of inquiry, no solid evidence had ever emerged to prove that the Templars had truly committed the crimes they were accused of. But truth no longer mattered. Philip had pushed too far, invested too deeply in their destruction, and Clement, despite his papal authority, was too politically weak to resist the momentum that had already sealed their fate. And so, on March 22, 1312, Clement issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, officially dissolving the order. This document did not declare them heretical. It simply announced that their existence was no longer viable, stating that the order had fallen into suspicion and disgrace, and that its continued operation was no longer in the best interest of Christendom. While it was not a direct condemnation, it was still a death sentence, ensuring that the Templars were erased as an institution, their lands redistributed, their members either absorbed into other religious orders or forced into exile. With their dissolution formally declared, Philip turned his attention to the final act of his vendetta: the execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Geoffrey de Charny, one of the highest-ranking members of the order. On March 18, 1314, these two men were led to the centre of Paris, condemned to be burned at the stake. The flames meant to obliterate not just their bodies, but the last remnants of the Templar legacy. The execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, on March 18, 1314, marked the final chapter in the destruction of the once mighty order. But it would also become one of the most legendary moments of medieval history. After years of imprisonment, endless interrogations, and forced confessions, de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny, one of the highest-ranking members of the order, were led to the execution grounds in Paris, where they would be burned alive for crimes they had almost certainly never committed. Their deaths were meant to erase the last remnants of the Templar legacy, ensuring that their influence, their reputation, and their place in Christian history would vanish in smoke and flame. But de Molay refused to go quietly. As the flames licked around him, as the crowd watched the supposed heretic face his fiery punishment, the Grand Master did something that would go down in legend. He spoke. He denounced the injustice of their trial, proclaiming their innocence, rejecting the charges of heresy and corruption, and calling upon God as his witness that they had been wrongfully condemned. And then, according to legend, he issued a curse, calling upon the Pope and the King to stand before God and answer for their crimes within a year. It was a final act of defiance, a declaration of vengeance not through battle, but through fate itself, ensuring that their betrayal would not go unpunished, even beyond death. As Jacques de Molay stood engulfed by the flames that consumed him, his final act became the most chilling moment in the downfall of the Knights Templar. The Grand Master, bound and burning, refused to die in silence, choosing instead to speak words that would echo through history. Words that would give birth to one of the most enduring legends of medieval Europe. According to those who witnessed his execution, de Molay did not plead for mercy, did not beg for forgiveness, did not repent, as was expected of condemned men. Instead, he called upon God as his witness, denouncing the injustice that had led him to this fate. He declared that the Templars had been wrongfully accused, falsely condemned, and betrayed by men who had sold their souls for power. Then, with his last breath, he allegedly issued a curse, not one of revenge, but of divine reckoning. With smoke rising around him, he proclaimed that both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV would stand before God within a year, forced to answer for their crimes against the Templar Order, for their betrayal, for the destruction of an institution that had once been the backbone of Christian warfare in the Holy Land. This prophecy, whether truth or legend, spread like wildfire to the people of Paris, who had gathered to watch the execution. De Molay's final words were not merely defiance. They were a warning, a declaration that justice would be served, not by men, but by forces beyond mortal control. The knights, who had once commanded vast armies, had been reduced to ash, yet their vengeance, according to legend, would not require swords or steel. It would come through fate itself. And strangely enough, within the year, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV were dead, fueling the whispered belief that the Templar curse had been real, a punishment from beyond the grave. The deaths of Philip V of France and Pope Clement V, both occurring within a year of Jacques de Molay's execution, fueled one of the most enduring legends in medieval history, the supposed Templar curse, a prophecy delivered by the Grand Master as he burned alive. Whether de Molay truly uttered those words or not, the coincidence was impossible to ignore, and many in Europe came to believe that Philip and Clement's demise was divine punishment, a final act of justice from beyond the grave. Pope Clement V was the first to fall, less than a month after ordering the dissolution of the Knights Templar. He suffered a debilitating illness, one that left him weakened and unable to rule effectively. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and by April 2013-14, he was dead, marking the end of a papacy defined by submission to the French crown. His death was seen by many as suspicious, whether by sickness or divine retribution. Clement had not lived to see the full consequences of his decision, and the Vatican, now free from Philip's control, began questioning the legitimacy of the Templar trials more openly. Philip IV followed only months later, struck down by a sudden stroke while out hunting in November 1314. Unlike Clement, Philip's death was more abrupt, more shocking, and for those who had witnessed de Molay's execution, it was an eerie fulfillment of the Grand Master's final warning. The French king had spent years plotting the destruction of the Templars, had manipulated the church, the courts, and the nobility to achieve his goal, and now he was gone, leaving behind a kingdom fractured by his actions and haunted by whispers of supernatural revenge. With both Philip and Clement dead, the question of the Templars' legacy remained. Though their order was officially dissolved, their vast network of estates, fortresses, and treasuries remained, creating a power vacuum that had to be filled. The majority of their lands and properties were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, the only other military order with enough stability to take over their holdings. But much of their wealth simply vanished, lost in the chaos of Philip's purges, or quietly absorbed into the French crown, ensuring that their financial empire never fully resurfaced. The dissolution of the Knights Templar, officially declared by Pope Clement V in 1312, left behind a vast network of estates, castles, lands, and financial resources, all of which had to be redistributed or absorbed. The question of what happened to their immense wealth, meticulously accumulated over nearly 2 centuries, remains one of history's great mysteries. Philip IV, the architect of their downfall, had hoped to claim every coin, every property, every financial instrument they controlled. Yet the results of his purge were far less organized than expected. Many of the Templar fortresses and estates in Europe were officially handed over to the Knights Hospitaller, the only other military order with the structure and reputation necessary to take over such holdings. This transfer, sanctioned by papal decree, ensured that Christian lands remained under the control of religious warriors rather than being carved up by secular rulers. However, not all Templar assets followed this path, particularly in France, where Philip seized anything he could, despite the Pope's directives. Treasuries were emptied, valuables were taken, and significant amounts of gold simply vanished. either into royal coffers or into the hands of opportunistic nobles who took advantage of the confusion surrounding the order's collapse. Yet, despite Philip's exhaustive efforts to track and confiscate every piece of Templar wealth, records suggest that a substantial portion of their fortune simply disappeared. Secret vaults, hidden caches, and unrecorded financial holdings may have allowed certain members to safeguard what was left of their order's riches, though no definitive evidence has ever surfaced. The legend of the lost Templar treasure, whether gold, relics, or documents of immense value, continues to fuel speculation and conspiracy theories to this day. With their organization dismantled, their leadership executed, and their properties scattered, the surviving members of the Templar Order faced a grim reality. They could no longer exist as the elite warriors they once were. Some faded into obscurity, disappearing into the fabric of history, while others found refuge within other military orders, blending into the Knights Hospitaller, Teutonic Knights, or even secular armies seeking experienced commanders. Though the name of the Templars was erased from official records, their influence never truly disappeared, leaving behind an enduring legacy of secrecy, mystery, and speculation about what happened to those who escaped Philip's grasp. The destruction of the Knights Templar did not result in the complete annihilation of every member. While their leadership had been executed, their assets seized, and their organization officially dissolved, a significant number of Templars survived the purge, albeit as scattered remnants of a once powerful brotherhood. With their order stripped of recognition, these knights faced a choice: fade into obscurity, abandon their vows, or seek refuge in other military and religious institutions. Many Templars quietly assimilated into different knightly orders, particularly the Knights Hospitaller, which had absorbed their holdings. Some found new purpose as mercenaries, serving kings and noble houses in conflicts across Europe. Others retreated into secrecy, perhaps keeping their traditions alive in hidden communities, though historical records of such groups remain speculative at best. However, their dramatic downfall led to something perhaps even more powerful than their military legacy: an enduring mythology. The idea that the Templars had vanished without fully disappearing sparked rumors that they had preserved their greatest secrets, including hidden treasures, mystical knowledge, and secret traditions. Over the centuries, countless conspiracy theories emerged, ranging from claims that Templar survivors influenced later historical events to speculation about an underground continuation of their brotherhood, still operating in secret. Stories of hidden relics, encoded messages, and lost archives transformed the Templars into an enigmatic force, ensuring that their name never truly faded, but instead evolved into legend. Though the official destruction of the Knights Templar was sealed with their dissolution in 1312 and the execution of Jacques de Molay in 1314, their legacy did not end. It simply evolved. Instead of fading into history, the Templars became the subject of endless speculation, theories, and myths, transforming their story from one of tragic downfall into something far more mysterious and enduring. Rumors of hidden treasure, secret relics, and mystical knowledge spread almost immediately after their suppression, fueled by the fact that much of their financial empire had seemingly vanished. Even Philip IV, who had hoped to absorb every last piece of their wealth, could not account for everything they had controlled. Had the Templars managed to secretly hide vast sums before their arrests? Had some escaped with the most valuable artifacts, ensuring that the true extent of their influence would never fully die? Then there were the whispers of surviving Templar lines, Knights who had avoided imprisonment, fled into exile, and continued their traditions in secret. Some believed the Templars had gone underground, disguising themselves within other military orders or creating hidden societies that carried on their knowledge and rituals in secrecy. Some claimed they had influenced later movements, shaping key events in European history, long after their supposed disappearance. As centuries passed, these theories only grew, fueling countless tales of hidden vaults beneath ancient churches, encrypted messages in historical documents, and secret brotherhoods protecting the last fragments of Templar knowledge. Their name became synonymous with mystery, woven into stories about Freemasonry, lost Christian relics, and hidden wisdom that had supposedly been safeguarded by the remnants of their order. Whether fact or fiction, one thing remains certain. The Knights Templar were never truly forgotten, their memory refusing to fade, instead becoming a legend, an enigma, a mystery that still captivates the world today. Now, with the tale of the Templars complete, it's time to put all thoughts of history and intrigue aside. Let your mind drift away from the medieval shadows. Let the weight of the past settle peacefully, and allow yourself to sink into quiet rest. Sleep comfortably without worry. For tonight, the legends will keep themselves. Good night. While the story of the Knights Templar is deeply rooted in historical events, much of what has been passed down through the centuries blends fact with speculation, legend, and myth. The Templars were indeed a powerful military and financial order, dismantled by Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V in the early 1300s. But the details surrounding their trials, alleged curses, secret knowledge, and hidden treasures remain subjects of debate rather than established historical truth. Some elements, such as their arrests, their dissolution by papal decree, and the execution of Jacques de Molay, are verifiable historical events backed by reliable records. However, theories of surviving Templars forming secret societies, protecting lost artifacts, or influencing future organizations have little definitive proof, instead evolving over time through popular storytelling and mystery. History often carries both documented facts and folklore, and the Templars remain one of the most fascinating examples of how truth and legend intertwine. With that in mind, rest easy tonight. Whether reality or myth, their story is one that will never truly fade. Sleep well.